But as I say, he experimented with many different types of training, but he's most popular, most well known for.
So hey guys, this is Shoaib and I'm back with another episode of Talk Show with Legends, and today I'm sitting down with someone I wanted to have an interview with for a long time. And so thank you for giving your valuable time and being on this and letting me have this interview. I'm going to start this interview by asking about what was RegWalk's, how did it all started for RegWalk, and what inspired him to become a competitive bodybuilder initially.
Well, we'll go back to his early days. He was always very athletic as a youngster during school, and he excelled in track and field, specifically in the sprints. But he also excelled in football, and I'm talking what they call in America soccer, but what we know as football. And when he was a youngster at school, I think as early as 12 years of age, he played for the equivalent of his state, which would be Yorkshire. He played for Yorkshire schoolboys, and he captained Yorkshire schoolboys. And later on, he ended up playing for one of the best teams, certainly in that era, and certainly in the late 60s, early 70s, which was after he had finished playing, was Leeds United. And he played for the reserve team. But his goal was that he wanted to turn professional. And he certainly had the ability to do so, but he got injured. And when he got injured, he injured his knee, and they gave him some rehabilitation work for his knee, doing some resistance training, which is when I think he first acquired an interest in the actual weight training field. A little later on, in his later teens, during the summer, he went to the local swimming pool. And, sunshine is pretty rare in the north of England specifically. But during the summer, they would make the most of the little bit of sun they get. And he was at the pool, and he saw this older guy walking around with a very good physique. And he went up to him and he said to him, "What do you do? How did you build your body like this?" He says, "I do weight training." And he said, "Would you like to join me?" And of course, my dad said yes. He had no idea what to expect. He went to the guy's home, and at the back of his house, there was a very rudimentary gym with just some weights and a bar and some, free weights lying around. And he started working out with him. And he said for the first 3 weeks, he found it incredibly boring. And he didn't know what the appeal was, but he said that the guy's mother was a very, very good cook. And in England, what's very popular, certainly in those days, is around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they'd have what they call high tea, which was a meal in itself, with cakes and pies and sandwiches and cookies, you name it. And he said that she was such a good baker that after they worked out, he would just sit down and eat. And then eventually he started, getting a little bit more serious and entering in magazine competitions. And I think his first proper competition was in 1946 when he was only like 16 years of age, and he placed fourth. But then obviously he continued, and he went to the military just after the Second World War. And when he was in the military, he served in, which was in Malaysia. And his job was to, well, first, prior to that, he was walking around, it was really hot there, tropical, and he had no shirt on. And one of the staff sergeants saw that he had a pretty impressive physique, and he said, "Would you like to be a PT instructor?" And he said, "Sure." So basically, he served his 18 months there being a PT instructor for the refugees. But he became friendly with the cook, so he ate very well all the time, and basically all he did was instruct PT, eat well, and work out. He came out of the army, and it coincided with the 1948 Mr. Universe, which was the first Mr. Universe contest held in London. And they also had, in conjunction with that, the British Commonwealth, the Commonwealth Games. And he went to see the competition, and in it was John Grimmick and Steve Reeves. And he was so impressed with both of their physiques. Grimmick had a more sort of rugged style of physique. Reeves had a more classical physique. But Grimmick was a master poser. And being such a big, strong man, in his 220s, he was also an Olympic lifter. He actually represented the U.S. in one of the Olympic Games as one of the U.S. weightlifting team members. And when he finished his posing routine, he ended up on the floor doing a splits, which was pretty unusual for a man of his size and stature, muscular guy, which apparently is what really brought the house down. And, he was just a little bit more polished on his posing than Reeves. And my dad made up his mind, and he said to the people around him, "I'm going to win that competition one day." Of course, he never entered in that level. So in 1949, they didn't have a Mr. Universe for whatever reason. They held it again in 1950, and he won the Mr. Britain, and which qualified him to enter in the Mr. Universe. The night before the Mr. Universe was the Mr. Europe, which he entered, obviously part of the same show and at the same venue, part of the whole weekend celebration, and he won the Mr. Universe. Mr. Europe. And the following evening was the Mr. Universe, which he entered and came second to Steve Reeves by 1 point. Now, Steve Reeves that was his last competition. And still today, I know I'm biased, but the pictures clearly show there haven't been that many, but there's, from different angles of them standing in the lineup together. And whilst Reeves had a beautiful physique, my dad was certainly more muscular and leaner than he was. I think it's pretty evident that his abdominals were much sharper, his serratus and intercostals were sharper, his pec line was sharper, and many people felt he should have won the contest. There was only a point difference, but Reeves was a big name. He was retiring, and he was a little bit more polished than my dad was with his posing. It didn't deter my dad. That, as a result of that, he was invited by the Weider brothers to tour North America, Canada, and the US. And in those days, the offices of the Weider brothers were in New Jersey. And Joe Weider actually made his way from London to Leeds, which was quite a way away, and went to my grandparents' home where my dad was living, and wanted to sign my dad up as one of the Weider bodybuilders. And in those days, they didn't have the IFBB. It was just the NABBA Mr. Universe, which is the big one. And so they signed a deal, and he invited my dad, all expenses paid, to go to the US and Canada, where he toured and stayed for around 6 months. When he was there, he trained in the States with all the famous guys at the time. He traveled around. He went to Florida. He spent most of his time in California. He was doing exhibitions at the various shows. He did an exhibition at the Mr. USA, and he also entered in America's Best Developed Athlete, which he won. And that's when, from that point on, he really, really progressed, because he trained with a lot of the top guys in New York. A very famous old-time bodybuilder who was super strong by the name of Marvin Eder. He trained in Sig Klein's gym, and then when he came to Los Angeles, he trained at Muscle Beach in Venice, and his physique really progressed a lot during that period of time. Then, of course, he went back to England, and he entered the Mr. Universe in 51, the following year, and it was like a completely different physique. He had matured, he put on a lot of muscle density and thickness, and he won it unanimously. Nobody even came close to him. So that was pretty much the start of his career. And then him and my late grandfather, they started the REG Barbell Company, where they sold equipment and T-shirts and all his booklets that he brought out, which are still available to this day. There's a guy in America by the name of Bill Hinburn, and he's got a company called Super Strength Training. And he was the agent for my dad's different booklets, chest training, the 5x5 principle, arms training, strength training. And he's subsequently, in the last several years, revamped all the programs, made the print bolder, put in some new illustrations. So they're still very popular to this day. And then he even had his magazine. He had his own magazine, which he published for 7 years. It was originally called, I believe, Man's World. It was called the Reg Park Journal. And then he teamed up with Man's World. And I have all the booklets, actually. They were put in bound volumes, 7 years of it, of these magazines. So developed a lot of popularity throughout Europe, selling, specifically in England, selling, all these different products and all the different gym equipment with training courses to go with it, gym bags, T-shirts, etc. And then he was invited to South Africa by a group of theaters, the biggest group of theaters in South Africa at the time, to come there. And what they would do is, typically he'd put on an exhibition every evening before, during the intermission of the movies, because in those days they'd have a movie, but they'd have intermission halfway through, so there'd be a break for people to go and get refreshments or go to the restroom or what have you. And so he would do this every night, but on Saturdays they used to have 3 shows, because they would have a matinee show, a 5 o'clock show, and then a 8 o'clock show. So he would do 3 shows on a Saturday. And this is the time when he met my mother. This was in 1952. And he met my mother, and of course the rest is history. They got married. Shortly after they got married, they went back to the UK, and they spent some time there. my sister and I were both born in South Africa, and we went back to the UK. And after a while, so-called, my sister and I were both born in South Africa, but we went back to live in the UK, and apparently my sister and I were getting quite sickly, and so was my mother from the climate. And a doctor suggested they go and live in a warm climate. So they had a choice of 3 places. One was my dad had visited Hawaii, and he thought it was one of the most beautiful places he'd ever been to. And then the other one was California, where he had already knew some people. And of course, the third one, which seemed to be the most practical at the time, was South Africa, because that's where my mother was from, and my mother had all her family there. So they went to live in South Africa. And that's where I grew up. And then shortly after my dad arrived in South Africa, he became a partner in a gymnasium. But after some time, he became the sole owner, and he built up his own chain of gymnasiums over the years. And of course, he started all the REG products in South Africa. Kept the company going in England for a while, but because he wasn't living there anymore, eventually it petered out, and he ran it throughout South Africa, supplying equipment to private individuals, to a number of the gyms in South Africa, to a lot of the sports stores, and he developed a pretty big mail order business. And he ended up, I think, with at least 5 gymnasiums throughout the country. And then there were several people who approached him to use his name, which they did as well. They paid him a royalty to use his name for their gyms.
Wow. So when you talked about his famous training protocol 5x5, so many people are still confused about what this training protocol actually is, like how this training split was 5x5.
That's better. So you want to talk about the 5x5?
Yeah, 5x5 training protocol.
So in the early days, he popularized the 5x5 system, which is still used a lot today. And he used this to put on muscle mass, figuring that in order to put on muscle mass, he had to work as heavy as he possibly could. Not to the extent of a power lifter or weightlifter who only go for a 1 rep max. So he had tried and experimented with various different routines, but he found the 5x5 was the most successful for him. And so basically it was doing all compound movements, 1 exercise per body part, and working the full body 3 times a week. So in other words, if we go talk about legs, you do 5 sets of 5 reps of squats, and basically work progressively heavier each set, adding on weight each set. He would do the same thing for a bench press, the same thing for back for a bent over row, the same thing for shoulder presses. So it never really included any secondary movements, for example, like lateral raises or flies. It was only compound movements. This worked very well for him. He put on a lot of mass. He was very, very strong. And later on, he started refining it when he was going for more polish of his physique, more detail. He'd add secondary movements and do a minimum of 8 reps on the secondary movements, because the secondary movement, it's not about moving poundage. It's more about feel. And secondary movements, you don't have as many joints engaged in a movement. For example, if you're doing a press, it's what we call a multi-joint movement because you have your wrist, your elbow, and your shoulder supporting the weight. But if you do a fly, there's no joints involved. It's pure connective tissue or muscle. And that's where a lot of injuries have come in over the years because people use secondary movements as a strength builder when they're really not. And it puts tremendous strain on the joint. The same thing could be said for a lateral raise. It's not the same as a shoulder press where all three heads of the shoulder are working, plus the joint of the shoulder, the elbow joint, and the wrist joint are all supporting the weight. But on a lateral raise, there's no joint support. It's just connective tissue. So while you will build some muscle, it's not the prime mover in building muscle mass for the whole area. It's limited how much muscle you will build on those movements. They're more for shape, more for detail.
One thing is like you talked about compound movements, right? So was it like the day you perform the lifts, you on Monday, like for example on Monday, will you do like a bench press with that military press, a squat, everything together, or was it like splitted?
No, he worked the whole body 3 times a week. Would start with legs, would then go into chest, would then go into back, chest, shoulders, and back in that sequence. But they would take a long time, the workouts, because, as I say, he would work progressively heavier each set with a warm-up set, say around 60% of the maximum weight, and then go 80% and so on, work heavier each set. Doing 5 sets and pushing poundages, the workouts could take about an hour and a half. Of course, he'd work his calves as well. Calves would always be high in rep range, around the 20 to 15 rep range. But everything was 5 sets, you know. And then over the years, he must have done every single routine you possibly could think of, it certainly at that time. You know, he'd do 4x8s, he'd do 3x15s. When he really, you know, put on the muscle mass and established the size, it was more about fine-tuning. You know, because he had the muscle mass, there wasn't really much more muscle mass he needed to put on for that time. It was all about the detail and the fine-tuning of it. And of course, as one gets older, it's very difficult to train those low reps all the time because it's very, very stressful on the body and on the joints. So, you know, later on, he would work out more than 3 days a week. In fact, he used to train 7 days a week because he loved training so much. Even up to the time when he competed in the Mr. Universe, his last one in the last one he won in 65, he was training 7 days a week, you know, and doing split routines, double workouts, 2 a day, you know, prior to the contest. But you know, as I say, he experimented with many different types of training, but his most popular, most well known for was the 5x5 because that's when really attributed to his strength and his gain in muscle mass.
Yeah. So one thing is that we have seen many pictures of Reg and Arnold together. So what was Reg and Arnold's relation like?
I'm putting it closer because I can't hear you too clearly, Civic. Can you repeat that about Reg and Arnold?
Yeah. You know, there are many photos of Arnold and Reg Park together. They used to train together. So what was their relationship like between the Arnold and Reg Park?
1966, after my dad won his last Mr. Universe, he was in the UK and he was touring and he was doing an exhibition in London. And the promoter of the show, who my dad knew very well, Wag Bennett and his wife Diane Bennett, who ran a gym from their home in London and promoted shows, said to my dad, there's a young kid here who's just won the Junior Mr. Europe. You his idol and he wants to meet you. At that stage, he was, I think, 18. And he apparently knew everything there was to know about my dad. Because when he was, I think, 14 or 15, he walked into a store in Graz in Austria where he lived. And there was a muscle magazine. And on the cover of the magazine was a picture of my dad, I think from one of the Hercules movies. And he said he took this magazine and he thought he was like quite fascinated. And he bought it and he took it home and he decided that's who he wanted to look like. That's what he wanted to do and that's who he wanted to look like. So he put my dad's pictures all over his wall. And he tells a story, which I've heard many times, which is quite humorous because he said, most young boys, teenage boys would have pictures of girls up on their wall. But he had like bodybuilders, and his mother got a little bit worried. But it was all pictures of my dad, and he molded his whole training on my dad. He copied all his routines that he read about in the magazines. So when my dad met him, he knew at the time that every year my dad would make a point of bringing out the best bodybuilder in the world to come to South Africa and tour the country and do exhibitions in the various cities throughout South Africa. And mostly they were Americans. And he knew all about this because they'd all write about the experience in touring South Africa. And he brought out the likes of Larry Scott, who came there the year before he won his last Mr. Olympia contest. Bill Pearl, guy by the name of Joe Abenda from New York, a Mr. Universe. Len Sell, a Mr. Universe from England. So he brought out a number of these guys. And Arnold said to him, when will you bring me to South Africa? And my dad said, well, if you win the Mr. Universe, I'll bring you. And the following year, he entered and won the Amateur Mr. Universe. And my dad, he called my dad, and my dad invited him to come to South Africa during the summertime, which was December. And I remember my dad going to we were in Durban, which is a coastal town. My dad picked him up and brought him straight to the beach. And I remember because he had just come from winter, his skin was exceptionally pale. My dad always had a very good suntan. He loved the sun, which is unfortunately what killed him in the end. But he was always beautifully tanned, and Arnold had this lily white skin coming from the cold of Austria. But they started to train together, and he stayed with the family for 2 months, and they toured the country doing exhibitions in every city. And typically what happened was each city would have a competition for the state. For example, they would have the Mr. Natal, where Durban was, the Mr. Cape Province, where Cape Town is, and so forth. And the winners of each competition would then finally come to Johannesburg, which was the grand finale. And that was the Mr. South Africa. And of course, the various winners of each competition would come and compete. And then, of course, my dad would guest pose, and then whoever the guest poser was at the time, and that was Arnold. So they developed a friendship. He became like a family member. He ate all his meals with us. He stayed in our home. And the first time he got there, he tells a story which he told at my dad's memorial when he passed in 2007 here in Los Angeles, which he and Maria hosted. And he said that he got to South Africa, and of course, at 4:30 in the morning, Reg wakes him up and he said, where are we going? He says, no, we're going to train. He says, but Reg, it's 4:30 in the morning. He says, yes, I know. I always train at 5 o'clock. Says he wasn't used to this. So they'd have cereal. He said, put protein powder on it and banana, and then they'd go and work out. And he said, he tells a great story. He said he thought he was strong because, first of all, he wasn't used to pushing so much weight at 5 in the morning. He says he was doing 350 pounds for standing calf raises. And the next thing, my dad just kept loading the machine until ultimately he was doing the whole stack, plus he had 2 people stand on top. He said it was the equivalent of sitting on top of the machine 1,000 pounds. And he said he couldn't believe it. He thought 350 was a lot, and here was Reg doing calf raises with 1,000 pounds. And he said that start squatting 350, then 400, and 450, 500. So I think he learned an awful lot from my dad during that time. And then, of course, they kept up their relationship, and Arnold visited South Africa numerous times as a guest of my father's over the years, until eventually they had the Mr. Olympia in South Africa in 1975, which they asked my dad to be the master of ceremonies, which he was. Now they host every year for the last 5 years. They didn't have it this year because of the virus. But this would have been year 5, I believe. They host the Arnold Classic in South Africa. The Arnold Classic has become a franchise. It used to only be in Columbus, Ohio, which it is. That's where it started. But it's now franchised to all 5 continents. So they have one in South Africa for Africa. They have one in I believe it's Barcelona for Europe. They have one in, I think it's São Paulo for South America. They have one in Australia for Australasia in Melbourne. And I believe they have another one in Hong Kong. And I think they're trying to get one in the Middle East. So there's 6 Arnold Classic competitions a year now, with the biggest one, the main one, being in Columbus, Ohio, where it started. However, this year the pandemic had just broken, so although they had the competition, they had no spectators other than the press and family members, so the atmosphere wasn't quite the same.
Mm-hmm. So another thing is, like, what was Reg Park's diet look like? What was his day in a diet look like? What he used to mainly eat? Because in that time, protein powders, I think they were not that famous, right?
No, he always ate very good quality foods, and also my mother happened to be an exceptionally good cook, and he liked home food a lot, and she was used to this because having all these bodybuilders come over every year, she's used to cooking for them. The one year was unbelievable because in 1975, Arnold stayed at our house, as well as Franco Columbu. And at one time at the house, after the actual competition, they toured the country. We had Arnold, Franco Columbu, my late uncle, my mother's brother, Johnny Isaacs, who was a 2-time Mr. Universe winner. They had Bill Grant, who was a former Mr. America, Mr. World, and a very close friend of Arnold and Franco by the name of Albert Busek, who was really the leader agent for Germany. So all of them were staying at their house at one time, and my mother was having to feed all these guys. But he always ate, he never really watched calories. Calories wasn't a thing of importance to him, but he always ate, wholesome foods, healthy foods, lots of fruit and vegetables, good protein sources. He used to drink a lot of milk in those days. He did eat quite a lot of red meat, but obviously much less later on. He liked sandwiches, but he had a very, very big, healthy appetite. And he would eat probably at least every 3 hours. He'd have his 3 main meals of breakfast, lunch, dinner, but he would have pre-workout meal, mostly of fruit in those days. He would have a mid-morning snack. He'd have a mid-afternoon snack. So he also had a very sweet tooth, but my mother used to make wonderful desserts, and all the bodybuilders used to love her desserts, but he was disciplined that if it came time for him to compete or do exhibitions, he would tighten up on that. But he was known for his sweet tooth. But I must say, nuts, whole nuts, he always had a very, very healthy appetite throughout his career. And his health, and then, of course, he started making his own protein powders. So he'd have protein shakes as well. He'd put protein powder on his cereal with breakfast. So, appetite, diet was never an issue with him. And he was very fortunate to have a very, very fast metabolism. Of course, over the years, they've become much, much stricter and more scientific with diet today than they were then. But, you can see that because physiques have changed dramatically. But unfortunately, which I know is a subject we're going to touch on shortly, is, then the pharmaceuticals, the performance enhancing drugs started coming in, towards the end of his career.
Actually, that's I think one thing that actually ruined the bodybuilding scene right now. People are just getting bigger and bigger by the day, and they're losing that aesthetic look that was one time.
100%. I couldn't agree with you more. Frankly, apart from the newer category today called classic physique, which the guys have appealing physiques, which is more appealing to me, and it's more in line with how I feel competitive bodybuilders should look, more in line with the likes of, my dad in his younger days and Steve Reeves and certainly Frank Zane, those type of physiques. I much prefer that. I think bodybuilding per se, the open category, has lost its way. I think aestheticism doesn't even play a role in it anymore. It's a mass game to the extent where the guys they almost look like they're mutants. I think the size is totally exaggerated. I don't believe it's humanly possible to get to that size naturally. I don't think it's healthy, and I think it's totally unappealing because they're disproportionate, and many of them, most of them, have these big midsections and waists, which it takes away the V-taper and they look bloated, So there's nothing appealing about it to me today. It's just gone overboard to the extent, Civic, that a number of years ago at the Arnold Classic in Columbus, Ohio, I'm probably going back about 5 years ago, Arnold actually got really upset, and he got up and he made a public announcement which went viral worldwide. And you obviously know what I'm referring to. And he actually had a go at the judges, and he said, this has to stop. It's unacceptable. Bodybuilders shouldn't look like they're pregnant, But sadly, it hasn't changed. I don't necessarily blame the bodybuilders because they're going along with what the current criteria is. I blame the judges because I think the judges are the ones that have set the standards. But even the way they pose today, I find unappealing. There's no aestheticism in a lot of the compulsory poses. For example, a lat spread, they stand with their feet wide apart, and the same thing with a double bicep. When they do a side chest shot in the old days, even up to when Lee Haney won the Olympia, when they do a side chest, they do a complete vacuum and show the whole rib cage and chest. Now it's kind of hunched over. They look awkward, and all they're showing is the side pec. They're not really showing the whole thoracic rib cage area. So it's totally unappealing. for the most part, in the old days, a lot of guys, training is very popular in the gym today. But if you ask most of the average people if they know who the current Mr. Olympia is, nobody would know. But in the old days, people would know who Mr. Olympia was, because although they were obviously bigger than the average person and was something the average person couldn't attain, at least for the most part, their physiques were appealing. I hate to say it, but I think after Lee Haney, the sport started to change. I think he was the last, for me, with the exception of two other physiques since then, winners. One was Dexter Jackson, and the other one was not this last year, the year before, Sean Roden, who's won it once. He took a title away from Phil Heath after Phil Heath won it 7 times. But they both Flex Wheeler. Yeah, but I'm talking about just winners. I'm only talking about Olympia winners. If Flex Wheeler, for me, should have beaten Dorian Yates. I think he had a much more pleasing physique. A lot of muscle, but small waist, small joints. I much more prefer that type of look. Unfortunately, he didn't win an Olympia, but I think he should have. As do I think several others should have over the years. But for me, Lee Haney was the last Olympia winner, as I said, besides Dexter Jackson and Sean Roden, that were acceptable Olympia winners to me. Since then, I think it's lost its way.
When talking about classic physique, who is a current favorite classic physique bodybuilder? There's Chris Bumstead. Then actually there are very few that I really remember, but Chris Bumstead physique actually is something that I like. So who is your current favorite?
To be fair, I don't really know the guys today. I see pictures of them in the magazine because I've lost interest in the sport on the whole. And I'm sorry the classic physique wasn't introduced a number of years earlier, because I did come to America to pursue bodybuilding and I really wanted to get into it. But I realized, and this was in 85 when I came here, that it was very difficult to achieve without taking pharmaceuticals. And I'm talking 85, so the amount that the guys were taking in 85 was nothing compared to what the guys take today. I'm not justifying it and saying it's acceptable. I chose not to go in that direction because I never wanted to subject myself to that. I had competed twice in South Africa, which I won. I was clean, I was natural, and I wanted to stay that way. And frankly, before I came here, my dad had said to me, he was right, unfortunately, but as they say, you can't put an old head on young shoulders. He said to me, you should finish your swimming career, because I was a competitive swimmer. And he said, give that a number more years, and there's plenty of time to get into bodybuilding. You're young enough, but you're still young for swimming. Now, I went to the Olympics when I was 19 in 76. I carried on for 2 more years. I regret the fact I didn't pursue it for another 2 Olympics, because I think I would have been 23 and 27. I would have probably been at my best. I was young. I wasn't fully matured yet. But I always wanted to get into bodybuilding. And when I finally did, he said, it's very difficult today without the pharmaceuticals. But he would support me. And my feeling was, well, if you trained hard enough, you ate smart, and you had good genetics, you could do it. But sadly, after a while, I realized that it was a futile goal. My wife was pregnant with our first child, and I thought, I'm not prepared to sacrifice my health for this, because if you think back, guys who are competing then, nobody even knows for the most part who they are. So, the money in bodybuilding then and even now is not that great compared to, most other professional sports. Yeah.
The amount is something which is set back. The amount of money the money that they spend on themselves and those all medicines, all the things, they don't even get that back.
No, that's so it doesn't really it doesn't add up. You did mention the classic physiques, but sadly, um, even those guys today are, taking a significant amount of pharmaceuticals. Maybe not to the same extent, but they're also taking it. So I kind of, I like looking at pictures of the guys online and in the magazines, and I say, okay, that's an appealing physique, it's an acceptable physique. But to be frank with you, I can't tell you that I know any of them. I'm still a fan of the old school. And when I say old school, I'm talking up to and including the early 80s, maybe up to and including when Lee Haney won his last Olympia. But I think there were some great physiques. Frankly, I think, in my mind anyway, Flex Wheeler, and prior to that, Danny Padilla, Muhammad McAway, Lee Labrada, and Francis Benfato should have all won on Mr. Olympia at various points, for me anyway.
Have you seen Melvin Anthony? Melvin Anthony? I think I've not heard him.
Melvin Anthony had a very good, a very pleasing physique, very good upper body. Very good. A little bit light in the calves for that level, but a very pleasing physique. I felt in 81, I wasn't there, but from the pictures I've seen and from what I've been told by people who were there, in fact, my dad was there, I felt 81, Padilla really got ripped off. I thought he should have won the Mr. Olympia. Franco won it, and I became very friendly with Franco. I had great respect for him. Franco trained at my gym, my last gym that I had. He said he enjoyed training there more than anywhere else because it wasn't overly crowded, and it was always nice to see him in there. I mean, he was tremendously strong, Franco, and he was a character as well. But I think that year, I think he was off. It was the year after Arnold won in Australia. But I think Padilla should have won it. I think Dickerson, looked very good. He came second. And I think third was Platts. And I think, Platts should have been third and perhaps Roy Callender fourth. The following year in London, in 82, Dickerson won, which he fully deserved to win. And then, those are the physiques I feel, as I said, Labrada and Benfato, they should have all won a Mr. Olympia for me at some point, as well as Flex Wheeler. Sadly, I don't know if you're aware, but Flex Wheeler had a leg amputated recently.
Yeah. Actually, I didn't got to listen. What were you saying, sir? Actually, I didn't got to hear.
Flex Wheeler had one of his legs amputated recently. You know about that, right? Yeah.
It was a sad story, actually. I don't want to take that name of that particular trainer, but whoever has trained under him had something like kidneys gone or leg amputated. A lot of things has happened in the recent.
Well, I know he had some problems, which they say is related to steroids. I don't know specifically which ones, but they say that he had problems. That's why he had to stop bodybuilding, because he had severe kidney problems. And I think they were saying from what I read, and it's kind of sad because I saw him at Franco Colombo's memorial service about, I want to say, a month before he had his leg amputated. And I went up to him and I said hi, and I actually said to my wife, Michelle, I said, do you remember that guy, Flex Wheeler? She said, yes. I said, he's had his leg amputated. And she said, the guy we just saw at Franco's memorial. I said, yeah. She couldn't believe it, But they say that it was from health problems, which originally started from, steroids. The problem is, for me, sorry to interject, I don't think they can keep their physiques for as long as they used to. I don't think their careers are that long. When you consider that my dad first competed in 1949, I believe, Mr. Northwest Britain, and then Mr. Britain in 50. And his last competition was in 73. That's a very, very long career. There's no ways that that people are going to be able to. No one has. There's no ways anyone can keep a career up for 24 years like that.
Longevity. Right.
Yeah, the longevity. Yeah. It's impossible. You can't abuse your body like that for so long.
This all things that they put in their body, eventually that's going to take a toll, and they have to stop it. So, of course.
Well, if you look back, if you go online and see over the last, 10, 15 years, of all the bodybuilders that have died prematurely, and I say prematurely because they died at a young age, it's kind of shocking to see guys dying in their late 30s and early 40s. I remember there was a very good bodybuilder who was from France, but I think originally Algerian, Mohammed Benaziza. I don't know if you remember him. And Benaziza was a short guy with a great physique. He won a contest. They used to have the Grand Prix tour in those days in Europe. And he was on a tour and he won a contest. And the next evening he died because he was so dehydrated and all he was eating was like an apple. So what they do to their bodies, also I think a lot of them I've noticed over the years, Suvik, that when they stop training, it's hard to tell they were ever ever competitive bodybuilders because their muscles atrophy. They just look like, in some cases, that they were fairly well-built athletes, but some cases they waste away to nothing. Some of them look like they've never even trained, whereas the physique from the old school was pure hard work and heavy poundages, and they were able to keep that muscle mass for a very, very long period of time. My dad still had that huge rib cage and broad shoulders until he got really ill, and then of course he lost like 50 pounds of weight, but he still had that carriage, and that just came from muscle maturity of years and years of hard work, so there was nothing artificial about the guys from that time.
Okay, so sir, thank you for giving your valuable time and letting me have this interview. And everyone who is watching this interview, go and follow Jon Jon Park to actually witness the old school of bodybuilding, the pictures from that time. And thank you for watching this video, and like this video and subscribe to my channel, and also share this video so that many people can hear the story. Thank you.
So Vic, thank you, and let's keep in touch now. And I'll be happy to do this again for you at some point if you want to talk about other things like more training specific things. I also wanted to let you know that since this COVID issue, I'm doing only online training now, and I'm offering it on an international level. So if anybody's interested, they can follow my Instagram, which is jonjon.park, and they can direct message me like you have over the last several months, and I can give them information because I can discuss with them the old school training principles, etc.
I will put down the link to his Instagram account. Do check it out. Thank you for watching.
Okay. Thank you, Suvik. All the very best to you. I enjoyed it. Appreciate it. Take time and have a good day. Bye-bye. Pleasure to meet you. Bye.